All right, hello again all. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Rebecca Mulqueen, and I am Switchboard's Program Administration and IT Coordinator. To start, I want to inform you that today's webinar is being recorded, and recording will be posted on the Switchboard website in the coming days. Thank you again for joining today's training on leveraging community feedback and community engagement. This training is presented by Switchboard, a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. Funded by ORR, Switchboard is implemented by the IRC. The IRC has partnered with LRF to provide employment-related training and technical assistance. I'd like to ask that if you are participating in this training with more than one colleague, but using a single computer, that you please type your names and organization into the chat so that we know who is joining us. Before we dive into the content, I'll briefly mention some logistics in WebEx. If you are using phone audio today, you can click the icon in the upper left corner at any time to find the dial-in number and code. If you don't see this icon, click anywhere on the main webinar screen and it will appear. We welcome your comments and questions throughout today's session. Click the chat bubble icon in the bottom center of your screen to open chat and type a response or question. Send your message to all participants so that we can all view your comment. Again, if you don't see the icon tray at the bottom of your screen, click anywhere on the main webinar screen and it will appear. Lastly, during Q&A, you can click the small hand icon at the bottom right to raise your hand so that we can unmute your line. Again, my name is Rebecca Mulqueen. I'll be assisting with Q&A and webinar support throughout today's training. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Brianne Casey. Brianne is a consultant supporting organizations in refugee resettlement and community development. And with that, I will turn it over to Brianne.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining us today. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm an independent consultant working in refugee resettlement and community development. I've worked at the local, state, and national level, and like all of you, I have had the privilege of having a front row view of refugees, immigrants, and their neighbors, creating stronger and more vibrant communities. So today, I'm excited to be discussing with you how to leverage feedback in community engagement. I think quite often in our community engagement work, we focus, understandably so, on outreach, right? On community messaging, on recruiting volunteers and donors, on great community events, and all of those things are very important. But community engagement is also a two-way process, and today we're going to focus on actively welcoming and benefiting from that feedback. So our objectives are that by the end of today's session, you will be able to apply a few relevant community engagement frameworks to your work. You'll be able to identify a few effective strategies for utilizing community feedback. And lastly, I'm hoping you'll be able to implement one or more tools we're going to share to strengthen your community engagement goals. On that note, in conjunction with the webinar, you will be able to access the Switchboard Toolkit, leveraging feedback in community engagement. This toolkit is currently available in the Switchboard Resource Library online and includes the tools that we're sharing today. And actually, I believe Rebecca also just chatted in a link. So if you like, you can open up that link and see the tools that we'll be talking about. I believe that a link will also be included in the email you will receive after this webinar. As we start today's webinar, I want you to think of some of your community engagement efforts so that we can apply some of the frameworks, strategies, and tools to your own context. So I want you all to chat in a bit in brainstorming fashion, some examples of community engagement in your work. And there's no wrong answer here. It can be anything big or small. So it can be something as small as your e-newsletter or a meeting you attended the other day, or it could be an event that you all do every year. But go ahead and chat in, if each of you would, one activity that you do of community engagement in your work. Okay, so it could be something big or small.
Brianne, we're getting a response from Zach. He said client feedback surveys with 20% of our resettlement clients.
Oh, great.
We also got Adrienne saying World Refugee Day event and art exhibit open to the community. And we had Tracy who said quarterly community dinners.
Great. Quarterly community dinners.
We also received a response that says volunteering. And someone else also mentioned World Refugee Day event. Excuse me.
Okay, great. Yeah, what are some of your other World Refugee Day events? Do you have an art exhibit?
We were also getting an e-newsletter and roundtables, viral hepatitis outreach, education, and training for underserved communities.
Okay.
Scott says, I hold open enrollment office hours at the local community college. Let's see. Kate has said, presenting in early childhood and family education classes. We're also getting monthly provider meetings.
Great.
Lots of responses. Let's see. Free movie screenings. Setting up a student club at the university in town, focusing on outreach and current issues regarding refugees.
Wonderful. Okay, so not surprisingly, it sounds like you all have some excellent community engagement activities going on along a wide spectrum. So thank you for those examples. And if you would, just keep those examples in mind as we go throughout today's webinar, because I will be referring to them later. Let's see. Before we jump into some tools, I want to share with you all a few frameworks that I hope you will find useful in your work, and that will make your work more effective. Like I said, keeping in mind those activities that we just shared. Okay. So one of the great things about all of our work is that we have amazing, capable clients, colleagues, and we're working in communities with a large amount of resources and opportunities. However, that can also present us with a positive challenge. I want to present to you this framework for thinking of where our community engagement efforts can be most strategic. So we're looking at this Venn diagram, and the yellow portion represents the gifts and needs of the community, right? That the yellow-orange portion on your left. So this is what our community really wants to do and give, whether that be volunteers wanting to welcome families, or a strong employer that's ready to employ a lot of your clients. And the community also has needs, right? So that yellow represents the community's gifts and needs. Those same volunteers will need training, or those same employers who want to employ several of your new arrivals might also need support. So that yellow is the community gifts and needs. The blue, the navy blue, represents your clients and their gifts and needs. So the clients might be willing to share their culture and experience with some of the volunteers. Your clients are ready to be those capable staff members for that employer that is hiring, but also your clients are going to have needs as well, right? They might have some English language training needs, or they may need an introduction to the public transit system before they start that job. So yellow is the community gifts and needs, blue is the client gifts and needs, and lastly, the orange portion represents you or your staff and your capacity to facilitate that engagement. So the idea of this overall framework, it's simple, but I find it helpful, is that your energy should be focused in that white central area, right? The overlapping of all of those things. Your capacity to facilitate the client's gifts and needs and the community's gifts and needs. So, for example, let me see. I'm trying to think of some of your examples. For example, the open enrollment at a community college, right? That probably is something that that community college was excited for you to do, and to make that connection that much stronger. And it was likely something that your clients were looking for also. It made their engagement with the community college resources that much easier. And it sounds like it was within your capacity, right, to make that happen. So you had the time and the connections to make that happen. So clearly that community engagement example was kind of within that white range. One time I find this framework particularly helpful is when I'm considering new inquiries or requests from the community. So for example, if a university partner is contacting me with a project that involves interviewing refugees, say for a study about nutrition, I might think about this framework and think, is this something that my community partner wants to do? Yes, they're calling me and proposing it. Is this something that clients want and need? Well, obviously nutrition is important to our clients, but it's not necessarily a need that someone has voiced to me recently. And perhaps if some of my clients have other employment or housing needs, it's not at the top of their list participating in this study. And lastly, this project, it sounds like it would involve a good deal of staff time and interpretation. So as I'm considering this request, the community engagement opportunity might not really be strategic for me to partner right now. It's not really in that white area. I do want to mention to you all that just because an opportunity does not fall in that white area does not mean that it's not a great project, and it doesn't mean that it can't happen. So for example, if that university partner were calling me, I could say, oh, that sounds like a great study. I don't think we can partner with you, but you know what? I've got a few minutes right now, and let's brainstorm a few options. I can tell you some of the community locations like laundromats or ESL class locations where you could post some flyers. I can tell you the top languages of our clients, and hopefully through the university you can find some translators to help you translate your flyers. So I like to use this Venn diagram to focus our efforts, but at the same time, if something doesn't fall there in that white area, you can oftentimes support it happening, elsewhere. But I think that you'll find our engagement efforts are going to create the most positive change when we focus them right there in that area of overlap. Okay. This next framework, since today we're specifically talking about community engagement and community feedback, I want to take a moment and share with you this framework from the community engagement world. It's the Ladder of Citizen Participation. This was introduced in 1969 by Sherry Arnstein, and she was referring to urban renewal and anti-poverty programs in the 1960s. This is our mini history lesson, and advocating that communities had a strong voice or should have a strong voice in the programs of that time. But she offers this ladder as a guide for community participation from high to low. I want to comment that Arnstein herself said that this ladder is meant to be provocative, but starting at the bottom of this ladder with community engagement, she starts with community engagement that is non-participatory and not very meaningful. In the middle area of the ladder, she is showing that you can inform partners with accurate, helpful information, but the partner is not really engaged in the program or in the decision-making process. And lastly, she puts at the top of the ladder robust participation in which community members have power and control over the programming and over the community changes. So this ladder may not be 100% applicable to our work, but as we're discussing community feedback more specifically, I think it's helpful to consider how we're using that feedback in our partnerships. And feel free to chat in questions if you have them. So this framework I would like to share is, I believe, quite directly applicable to our work. In this framework, resettlement colleague Paul Stein shares 3 platforms for community engagement in refugee resettlement. You can access this framework in the Welcoming America resource, Building and Sustaining Community Collaborations for Refugee Welcome, a community engagement toolkit. It's available on the Welcoming America website and the Switchboard resource library as well. And in fact, I would encourage you to read the toolkit. I'm taking a bit of liberty in summarizing this, and it's also a great resource if you have time to look through it. Stein first starts by identifying our collective goal. I put it up there in orange. Our collective goal is welcoming communities everywhere that are inclusive, equitable places where everyone can reach their greatest potential and contribute to a prosperous economy and a flourishing culture. Not a bad goal for us all to be working towards. This framework helps us consider that our community engagement work will happen on 3 different platforms. So he is not necessarily saying that one platform is better than another, but that depending on our goal or which partner we're working with, we might be informing, we might be investing, or we might be involving. In the toolkit, I like how he says that we want our community engagement relationships to be efficient, effective, and elegant. And so for some relationships and some of our partnerships, that might mean working on the informing platform, and for others, it might mean the involving platform. So the informing platform is going to be providing information to partners about refugees and immigrants, communicating information about our programs and services. My communications colleagues like to remind me that we should provide a steady, constant flow of positive and accurate information. So that would be on that inform platform. Investing would be collaboration between programs or working together with clients and partners to address multiple objectives. And lastly, that involving platform would have the involvement of perhaps cross-sector stakeholders or collective approaches. It might involve individual clients and community members contributing expertise and working together for desired change. So Stein is saying that in our world, our work will likely fall on each of these platforms. Okay, so considering those three platforms and the examples you all shared at the beginning of the webinar of engagement activities in your work, let's think of perhaps one of these examples. For example, the free movie screening. I'm assuming, we can assume that it was a refugee-related movie screening and the community members came and visited. If that person wants to chat in what the, what the movie was, we might be curious. But anyway, let's use that as an example, a free community movie screening of a refugee or immigrant-related film. And I believe Rebecca has a poll for us.
Yeah, so on the bottom right of your screen, you should now see a polling box and be able to select one of the responses. Your responses are anonymous, so I'll give you guys 20 seconds to select an answer, and then I will share percentages that everyone chose.
So that example of the movie, would that be informing, investing, or involving?
So about 15 more seconds left on the poll. 5 seconds to get your responses in. And the poll has now closed. So I will share the results now.
Great. So it looks like the majority of respondents said that it was an example of informing. I would agree. Let me see, because likely the people who attended are just learning information. It might be a little participatory, but they're not necessarily partnering. They're learning. Although, like I said, we do like to provide a constant flow of accurate information. So I think providing that free movie screening is an excellent opportunity to do that. Okay, let's see. Let's move along to one more example. Let's see. The person who mentioned the health item, I believe it was like the hepatitis outreach. I'm going to imagine that that involved some partnering with another organization, right? Likely your local health clinic or another healthcare provider, and that was likely something that clients were also attending. So let's look at that as an example, and I believe Rebecca will pull up a poll again.
Yep, so now there's a second poll up. You can do the same process as before, and again, I'll give you guys about 30 seconds.
So would that be informing, investing, or involving?
There's about 15 seconds left to submit your answers. 5 more seconds. And now the poll has closed. So again, I will share the results that everyone submitted.
Okay.
See those?
I can, yes. So it looks like most people said involving, and a few folks saying investing. And I think that that's fair. I might lean more towards investing, just because I'm imagining it was more of like a two-organization partnership, but it might have been quite multi-sector, which would make it involving. So I think that you all did a great job of that, and I believe that these are likely examples of how those community engagement efforts were efficient, effective, and elegant, and that those can take place on any platform. Great. So whether your work is employment, health, mental health, case management, or other, we're not just participating in community engagement to kind of check our community engagement box. We're engaging with the community because it provides the resources, connections, and opportunities our clients need to achieve their goals. And community feedback has a critical role in that effective engagement. So first, it provides the knowledge, experience, and skills to improve your programs and outcomes. And second, welcoming community feedback with clarity and transparency establishes relationships based on trust and shared success. And the importance of that clarity and transparency in stakeholder relationships is something that we will refer back to. Next, let's move on to some strategies and methods for utilizing feedback. So in this webinar, we're going to explore 3 possible tools for collecting and utilizing community feedback or feedback data. But anytime you collect data, there are a few key questions that it's helpful to ask, right? You want to ask yourself, what do we want to learn? What actions or decisions will we take as a result of this data? Who in the community will provide this data? Which data collection methods are best suited for this feedback? And what human and financial resources will we need to collect this feedback using these methods, and do we have them? But the important thing is that these questions lead you through the process, right? So that before you start collecting data, you know how you will use it effectively. So like I said, today we're going to look at 3 possible tools or structures to welcome and utilize feedback. The first one I want to share with you is the possibility of creating a working group in your community. So establishing a working group in your community can be a great way to actualize promising ideas or to address barriers to success for refugees and the community as a whole. The structure I'm going to share today is a working group that would complement your community consultation process. But before we get started, I'd like to know if any of you have ever organized or participated in a community working group there in your community.
You'll see a poll on the bottom right of your screen as before. So we'll give you 30 seconds to respond.
I know I live here in Charlottesville, Virginia. I know that there's a local working group that convenes its healthcare providers, interpretation service providers, and I believe the local health department.
Okay, a couple more seconds for you guys. And the poll's now complete. And here are the results.
Great. Let's see. So we had about 13 people saying that they have participated in a working group, and 9 that said that they had not. But I'm interested to hear the 13. Actually, if you could chat in, let me know if there was let us know if there was a specific focus area for your working group. Those folks that did participate in a working group, if you could let us know what areas your working group considered.
Zach said he participated in a housing working group.
Oh, great. Any others?
We also have a refugee health working group from Monica.
Okay.
And Christopher said resettlement quarterly consultations.
Great. So as these topic areas illustrate, oftentimes lots of promising ideas or barriers to success are in areas that span the interest or work of multiple organizations. One reason I'm sharing this structure with you is that as advocates for refugees, resettlement professionals were often the first point of contact for community members when they have opportunities or barriers. However, it's not always within our locus of control to act on these opportunities. So working groups are a great way to incorporate a broad base of individuals' energy and expertise so that you can channel some of these ideas or barriers while working within staff capacity. And I think those of you that shared your experiences in your focus areas really illustrated this, right? Like housing or health. A lot of times those are areas that could really benefit from multi-sector collaboration. Establishing a working group as a complement to your existing community consultations process also capitalizes on what you're already currently doing while connecting the working group with a broad range of partners needed for success. So a working group can be established in many different forms. One possible definition of a working group is a collection of individuals collaborating on an issue requiring their expertise or time. A working group gathers input, performs research, identifies needs and resources, and drafts, then executes a plan to achieve an objective. So as you see from this definition, the working group is responsible for not only proposing and investigating solutions, but also executing a plan and achieving an objective within, say, a 3 to 12 month time period. Therefore, it's important that the issue selected and action plan drafted are both actionable and time bound. So after the working group has concluded their wrap up, they may go ahead and select a new issue, and they may create a new working group. Let's see, and once a working group is established in your community, you have this way to effectively receive and channel and support community ideas that may fall outside the scope of your work. And I want to be clear that I don't think that there's one correct way to organize a working group. However, I want to share this definition and a few milestones that might be helpful for those interested in creating a working group. In context, so some of the milestones of initiating and carrying out a working group. In contexts where a chair candidate with strong interests and organizing skills is evident, appointing that person might likely be the first step, right? You might have a great capable volunteer or a member of your consultation group or a university staff member. Ideally, it's not you who has just the interest and facilitation skills that you as an initiator and the working group and your community consultation colleagues can reach out to this person. The toolkit includes a sample position description if that would be helpful. If you don't have a great chair candidate, however, you can always move on and identify the issue first and find a chair later. Okay, so next we're going to determine the working group focus. There's a chance you already have determined your focus. Maybe interpretation is a challenge for some of your partnering service providers, or perhaps transportation. So maybe you already have your first focus area in mind. But before we collect feedback, we're going to ask, kind of what do we want to learn and why. The feedback we will be collecting here is for the purpose of determining the most effective focus for the working group if you don't have one already. I also want to mention that this is not, the tools that I'm providing here are not for a formal needs assessment for the refugee community as a whole, but it's basically a participatory process for selecting the working group focus area. Okay. So how are we going to welcome feedback for the working group? One of the most frequent ways we receive community feedback is the simplest form there up on top, right? Individual comments. Any community member's comment can be passed along to the working group chair or members. So for example, if a community member is concerned about the challenges, like I said, maybe poor public transit options on the weekends, when the refugees that they know need to get to work. The service provider that might be talking with this community member can offer to pass this comment along to the working group. They can say, hey, actually there's this community working group. They pick a different topic each year or each period. I'm going to pass this along to them as a possible issue. Okay, so that's a very simple means of welcoming and channeling community feedback. You could also, the second one there is you can set up an online input form through something as simple as a Google Doc. So any community member could visit that form. There's a sample input form in the toolkit, and it can have simple prompts such as what is the idea or barrier to success that you would like to share? How did you learn about this? Do you have any solutions or additional information that might be helpful? And this Google form could be monitored by the working group chair. And actually, Rebecca can chat in a link if you all want to take a look at an example. You can click on the link.
I've just inserted it.
Thank you. The toolkit also includes a simple informal activity that can effectively gather feedback from your clients. Many of you may have used this simple activity before, but you basically ask a group of clients what were the easy and difficult things for refugees in your city. You can ask them to each write or draw their idea on a Post-it note, and you go around and share it one by one before commenting on any of them so that everyone has a chance to share their thoughts and ideas. An English language training provider who's part of your community consultations could offer to do this activity as one of their lessons to bring back some of your clients' feedback into the process. Another option would be to do a small client survey. The survey is best used if you've already identified maybe a few potential issues and want some feedback on which of those might be most helpful. While it's difficult for any one organization to kind of launch a survey with appropriate interpretation, this once again, in kind of like sharing and maximizing staff capacity, the survey could be split up between members of the community consultations if each person agreed to complete, say, like 5 of these surveys with their clients using their existing interpretation resources. The toolkit also includes some links to Meta's like 5 steps for planning surveys and collecting client feedback data. So those are helpful resources to reference as well if you're going to undertake this feedback channel. Lastly, existing community consultation meetings you're engaged in can highlight opportunities and challenges in the community and for refugees. So an ideal working group focus might already be apparent from your meetings, and you can look back on past reports or even just use it as an agenda item in an upcoming meeting. Okay, so you have a range of possible focus areas, anything from perhaps some community stakeholders having challenges finding interpretation resources, or perhaps limited public transportation on the weekends. Okay, so how are you going to select and define the issue? I'm proposing these 3 criteria you can use. Level of need, so you're going to look at your options and judge them based on level of need, potential for impact, and likelihood of progress. I want to highlight the importance of that last likelihood of progress criteria, since the working group is likely just to be working for a time-bound period, maybe 6 to 12 months, and going to make an impact during that time. You're going to want to make sure that the issue you select is achievable and time-bound. So, for example, if expanding affordable housing in your city is a topic frequently mentioned, and another topic for consideration is perhaps making English language training resources more accessible, maybe closer to the places where clients live or at better times. The topic might have a higher likelihood, the English language training might have a higher likelihood of progress in 6 to 12 months than, say, expanding affordable housing. It is important that community member contributors are informed of these criteria so that they understand that their issue may not be selected. So we spoke earlier about how leveraging feedback strengthens stakeholder relationships and establishes trust when it's clear, when it has a clear purpose and transparency. So whether you're doing the online input form or just offering to pass along individual comments, you want to let your community members know that you're using these criteria to select the topic. So their topic, though important, might not be selected. Let's see. You will also want to decide early in your process, likely the chair and initiators can decide this, who will make the decision based on these criteria. And the toolkit involves some possibilities. You could do consensus among a small group of people. It could be the decision of the chair, voting of a certain group, or pairwise ranking, which is kind of an example of like consensus voting. Okay, and next we are going to establish and recruit your working group members. Consider the strengths you need in the group, such as time for research, specific knowledge. Group members could be clients, they can be volunteers, local university staff, community members with expertise, or representatives from a community organization that is directly involved in the topic. Next, you're going to research possible solutions. No matter what the issue, it is likely that this is also an issue present in other communities. The group can always investigate the solutions in other localities. If a good amount of research is needed, you could consider seeking a college class to collaborate. The class could break up into groups, research possible solutions, then present back to the working group. Before deciding on an action plan, the group may choose to share solutions with the community consultation group or a group of refugees, either in person or submitting a plan to a facilitator. The working group could provide prompts such as what is most helpful in this plan or what additional ideas should we consider. And then the working group and chair should also be transparent and let any contributors know that all the suggestions will be heard and considered, but the working group may not be able to incorporate all suggestions. I think the great thing of this working group is with things like the solutions validation meeting, it kind of can help you take advantage of some of those community members that might not have so much specialized knowledge about refugees or about clients, but then at the same time with check-ins, such as the solutions validation meeting, you can kind of come together and they can share their research and knowledge, and you can also share some specialized knowledge as well. Next, the working group will lay out their plan, breaking it into steps and determining who will be responsible. And they will then begin carrying out their plan. So for example, if we use the issue of limited public transportation over the weekends, and research had revealed that some other similarly sized cities use vehicles from their ADA paratransit service on Sundays to provide transit from key stops to major employers, the working group could get to work, starting the steps of identifying the key stops and working with major employers and their local transit to determine different shift times, et cetera. Okay, so lastly, the chair will develop a brief one-page report that can be emailed to anyone who contributed feedback. For example, the online form included a checkbox that said, I don't know if any of you were able to click on that link, but there was a checkbox in that community input form that said, yes, I am interested in this work. Please email me the working group's achievement report. Or if an English language trainer facilitated an activity for client feedback, you could provide the report to them, which they could share. But this is a succinct way to kind of wrap up the working group session. Like I mentioned before, you will want to use the working group structure and milestones that best work for your needs and your context. However, the definition of a working group, proposed chair position description, and these milestones I'm hoping might be helpful to you. And at the beginning of the webinar, we invited you to chat in your comments and questions. Before we move on, Rebecca, to the next tool, have there been any questions chatted in regarding the working group?
Not so far.
Okay, great. Feel free to chat those in. And we're also going to have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so you can feel free to chat in your questions then as well. The second structure I want to talk about is basic, but it's also very effective. And it's a very important one to have as part of your programming, and that is having an annual volunteer survey. And before we go any further, I'm curious, how many of your organizations survey your volunteers annually? Volunteers are some of our most valuable allies.
And for the last time, you'll see a poll at the bottom right of your screen where you can select a response, and I will give you 30 seconds.
So does your organization survey volunteers annually? Yes, no, or perhaps not applicable if your organization does not utilize volunteers?
Okay, 10 more seconds left on the poll. And the poll is now closed, and I will share the results for discussion.
Great. So it looks like most people, 10 of you all said no. There's 8 people who are currently polling their volunteers, and then it looks like there are 8 who do not have volunteers with their organizations. Certainly understandable. We have a wide spectrum of folks different work with us today. And I hope that for those of you already surveying your volunteers, this might give you a few ideas for improvements. And for others, this is going to be, I want you to consider implementing an annual volunteer survey. There's a really easy example there in your toolkit, so it shouldn't take too much time for you to implement one. Okay, I wanted to share with you a few keys to volunteer retention. These keys to volunteer retention can also serve as guideposts to a strong volunteer program in general, and it helps with the big picture of why you might want to do a volunteer survey in the first place. So volunteers stay because they feel welcomed and appreciated. Their tasks and procedures are clear. They have bonded to someone in the organization, and they feel that their feedback connects them to program success. Also, they have opportunities for new challenges and skills, and they feel that they are creating change. I think if you have had a positive volunteer experience, or if you think of your strongest volunteers at your organization, many of these conditions apply. Connecting this to the next tool, having an annual volunteer survey makes for a strong program because it, like some of these conditions, it helps your volunteers feel welcomed and appreciated. The survey can remind them that they are creating change, and it also means that they have a voice in the organization, the fact that you're asking them to complete it. In addition to adding to volunteer retention, an annual volunteer survey can collect important data to improve your volunteer program and support other programming. So let's talk about a few elements of an effective survey. As we discuss the elements of an effective survey, I want to mention that the toolkit includes a sample survey, and we are going to put a link in the chat box for an online version of the sample survey, so feel free to click on the link and click through it. That way you can see what it might look like if you're using an online survey platform. I believe this one is SurveyMonkey, and Rebecca will stick that in the chat box. And so the elements of an effective volunteer survey. First, it gives you specific advice for improvement. So in other words, the data from your survey doesn't just tell us, hey, are volunteers happy or dissatisfied, but it actually tells us ways that we can improve our programming with specific advice. I want to see if any of you have experienced this, those of you who are completing surveys. Let's see. So what is an example of a survey response that caused you to make a change in your work? So those of you who are surveying your volunteers, what is something that you learned that then had you make a change in your work?
So Brianne, we had a response from Adrian who said, feedback helps us to improve our intern onboarding process.
Oh, perfect. And actually, if Adrian, if you wanted to provide any additional details, that would be great. How did you change your intern onboarding program? I know that I spoke with a volunteer coordinator the other day in Utah at the Catholic Community Services, and she was saying that because of the feedback they got on their survey, they decided to switch their volunteer training from in-person to online.
We also got another response from Christopher. He said, giving more time flexibility to volunteer shifts can improve retention.
Great. You know, and I'd imagine that would be something that if you didn't provide opportunity for that feedback, right? If you were just kind of asking, hey, are you happy as a volunteer? Yes, no, maybe. You know, you wouldn't have found that, hey, maybe those shifts or maybe those time periods is keeping some people from volunteering.
Adrian did actually give some more details. She said, we created materials for supervisors to ensure interns across programs were all getting the same information and the same level of onboarding.
Perfect. And I bet that kind of reaches back to, remember how we said that like happy volunteers, it's when their procedures are clear. And so kind of this, the survey probably lets you know, hey, some of our instructions and tools could actually be a bit clearer. So it sounds like you all are doing a good job of structuring your volunteer surveys so that it gives you that actionable information to help you make those improvements. Okay. Let's see. Moving on to number 2, a survey in and of itself reminds volunteers that you value their opinion, right? And it can prompt them also to stop and think about the value of their service. Third, a survey can add to your toolbox of resources and tips and tools if you ask volunteers for suggestions. A survey can also collect needed data for learning and reports. So you may want to ask your coworkers to think about all of their annual reports and proposals and to let you know what volunteer data they will need. Now, this is an opportunity. We've talked about being clear and transparent with your community stakeholders and their expectations. This is an opportunity to be clear and transparent with your coworkers and let them know that you might not be able to include all of their data needs in your annual survey because you're going to want to keep this short. But several of their annual reports may ask for volunteer hours or miles driven. And if you're not collecting these in another way, I know some of you have your volunteers do monthly or weekly forms, but if they're not, this annual survey might be a good way to collect some of that data that some of your colleagues are going to need throughout the year, but you don't know if you don't ask them. And sometimes they need a little prompting to think through their annual reports. Let's see. Next, your survey can support other engagement. So you could use a positive comment from your survey in a Facebook post or your volunteer engagement materials. And lastly, you may want to include a benchmarking question that instead of asking for specific advice, maybe you do ask volunteers to offer an overall opinion or rating so that you can see if your program is improving over time. So in other words, if you ask volunteers to say if their experience was poor, good, or excellent, and then you use that same question in the next year's survey, it can help you assess if you are improving your programming. So let's take a look. This is the sample survey in the toolkit. So if you're not doing a survey, you don't have an excuse. You could very easily use this one this coming year. It reminds volunteers that you value them, that blue arrow up at the top. You're saying, thank you for completing this survey. You're also prompting them to take a minute and think, hey, do you think that your support has helped refugees feel at home in our community, or whatever kind of your objective is for your volunteer programming. But it prompts volunteers to stop and think not only, oh, thank you for valuing me and my opinion through this survey, but also, let me stop and think, has my support helped refugees feel at home in my community? It also asks for specific advice. Like we said, what suggestions do you have for improving our volunteer training? It sets benchmarks for future comparison. How likely would you be to recommend my organization to a friend or colleague, where 1 is not likely and 5 is very likely? It collects information for organizational learning and reports and proposals. For example, this one asks, my organization is exploring providing support to refugees in this focus area. Do you think this focus area is important for refugees in the city? If so, why? This might be if one of your colleagues were working on, for example, a proposal or something, and thought that they were quite likely to use a volunteer quote. Now, if they don't think they're likely to use it, you don't want to collect it. But if they think that they're likely to use it, then you could include that here. Then lastly, let's see, it can fuel future efforts. So make sure that you're asking your volunteers their permission to share any comments in publication or materials. So before we move on to a third tool, any questions about the volunteer survey? I think that's all pretty straightforward. But if any questions have come through, I'm happy to answer them.
We did have one question from Camille. They said, what if there is a low participation rate when the annual volunteer feedback survey is emailed out?
Yeah, good question. I think that another, well, first of all, email it out to everyone, right? And then honestly, one thing that you could do is, when you know that person, if you have an upcoming volunteer event, you could actually have it in hard copy and ask folks to fill it out before they leave. Another option would be if you get a poor response rate, I would go ahead, even though you're not, this sample survey actually asks people, hey, can we share your feedback? And if you do, then we ask for their name and how long they've volunteered. But another option would be, honestly, if you don't have too many volunteers, to send out like individual, emails and just say, hey, you've been volunteering for a long time. I'd really appreciate your feedback. So that would be my strategy. If you got a low response rate on your, group email, if you have some events coming up, just have it in hard copy. And honestly, necessarily ask everyone, like pass it out and ask everybody to put it on the table as they leave, or go ahead and follow up with individual emails, and maybe that individual to their name, and you saying, I'd really appreciate your feedback, might be what puts it over the edge to get them to respond. But that's an excellent question. You could also, a lot of people, do different things. Like you could send it to them with like a, $5 Starbucks card or something like that. But I think most of us are just kind of busy. So that extra personal email or just having it printed out there at your next meeting or event might do the trick. Okay, my hope is that this training will give you a few takeaways that you can implement in your work. So perhaps you're now thinking of initiating a working group or using an annual volunteer survey. A third structure for utilizing community feedback is to add an annual 25-minute community concern and confirmation training as part of an upcoming staff meeting. In addition to surveys and working groups, we know that individual interactions with volunteers and community members is one of the most frequently and accessible forms of feedback, right? Knowing how your staff and supervisors will receive that feedback as a team situates you to handle this feedback professionally. So the toolkit includes a sample staff training activity. It starts with a handout with pointers for what you can think, say, and do when receiving and responding to a concern or confirmation of positive work. So the purpose of this tool is not necessarily to use it as is, but it's for your team and supervisor to use it as a prompt to determine, what is going to be your shared strategy for responding to individual comments. The first pointers are advice on maintaining a healthy perspective regarding community concerns from an individual, such as a volunteer or a stakeholder. So for example, when hearing a concern, a lot of times I tell people, you should just expect that each individual having a concern is going to have a different view of the issue, right? So don't waste too much energy thinking, why do they think this? Or how could they think this? Try to remember that having different community members with different perspectives on issues is actually one of the benefits of community engagement. So when folks are coming to you, just know that off the bat, everyone's going to have different perspectives on an issue's urgency or importance. Another good thing to remember is that just because a community member is bringing a concern to you does not necessarily mean that you're doing a bad job. In fact, the concern may not relate to your work, and it might not even be your responsibility to fix it. But however, it is all of our jobs to receive compliments and concerns professionally and respond effectively. So just don't let it, get you down if folks come to you with concerns, but know that that you can do your job quite well by welcoming those concerns and responding professionally. We'll talk when we get to the do about what you can do, but maintaining that healthy perspective as a staff and discussing it together will help you be ready to receive that community feedback. So that's kind of the thinking area of things. And in addition to considering what to think, when refugee concerns and compliments come to you, the staff training would give you an opportunity to practice what you're going to say. So a few key phrases. We know that our clients have a lot of strengths and that they make a lot of contributions to our community. We can reinforce this anytime a community member remarks positively regarding a client. So we can say, that's great to hear, I know, and then kind of go back with another thing that you've been impressed with that client, or say that you've been impressed with their determination or progress. So just kind of welcoming their feedback and re-emphasizing the forward movement and progress of our clients. A helpful phrase when receiving concerns could be, and I think that this is very applicable one to many situations. We provide high quality services, whether that be, insert your services there, healthcare services, employment services. If a client did not receive those services, we are going to address it. So the training involves just a few key phrases that you can use and practice as a team. The third selection of the staff training is what to do after receiving receiving a concern or compliment. So the options, this could range from, if you weren't aware of something, expediently addressing the situation, or another option could be asking the community member to encourage the client to speak with you directly, or to going and sharing this concern with your supervisor. So the last part of do in any of these situations is also can be to think about how you can learn from that situation and improve your services in the future. Also, if you are on the receiving end of a compliment, make sure that you always share it with your colleagues, and make sure that if you're carrying some things home with you at the end of the day, that memory of that positive comment is one of the things that you take home with you at the end of your workday. As part of this staff training, you can practice with the provided scenarios or use examples from your own work. For example, office director recently told me about that their last community concern was a volunteer who had helped facilitate a family in enrolling the kids in a private school, but then the family decided that they wanted to transfer the children back to public school, and the volunteer was very concerned about this. So that was a recent concern, and you as a staff could kind of practice, okay, when that community member came to your staff colleague, what did they say, and kind of role play what that colleague could think, say, and do in that situation. So not very exciting, but like I said, this is one of the more frequent ways we receive feedback, and honestly, just taking 20 minutes and doing this activity each year, and knowing from your supervisor kind of what they would advise for thinking, saying, and doing really poises us all to really welcome that feedback and, like I said, respond professionally and effectively. So if you're a supervisor, I hope that you're considering adding this to an upcoming meeting. If you're a staff member and you interact with community members often and think it would be helpful to have a discussion with your colleagues and supervisors about this, you can use this training as a prompt to go mention to your supervisor that you would like to have this discussion as a staff. And as with the other tools, this tool and staff training exercise is available in the toolkit as well.
Okay, so just to review a couple of recommended resources, as Brianne's been mentioning, we do have this toolkit that is available on our resource library, and the link to that is available in the chat box. I also just inserted a link to the customized technical assistance forum on the Switchboard website, where you can go and let us know about any specific TA requests that you might have. You can include plenty of information about the different format that you would like, specific topics and learning objectives, and then we can review that and reach out to make sure that we can address the TA that you would like. And lastly, I wanted to point out that we do have an upcoming webinar on July 8th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on strengthening refugee integration through community resource mapping. And after this webinar, you'll receive an email which will have links to all of these resources and, of course, to the toolkit and the resource library as well.
Great. So I hope that this session has presented you with some community engagement frameworks that you can apply to your work. Maybe you'll be thinking of that Venn diagram or thinking about, as you come up to your events this coming week, about what platforms the different activities and events and activities are in. I hope that it has given you a few helpful structures and strategies to welcome and use community feedback. And lastly, whether you're thinking about maybe working a community working group or an annual volunteer survey or getting together as a staff and talking about receiving and acting on individual feedback, I hope you're maybe walking away with at least one or two ideas of how you can structure your work to welcome and utilize feedback for your goals.
Are there any outstanding questions that you would like to type in the chat? I can read them out for Brianne to address before we wrap up.
I did also want to mention, I know in the registration questions, a few people asked about collecting client feedback, and I did want to engage in former clients, and I think that the community working group references somewhat, to incorporating client feedback, but that also you can check out the Switchboard webinar. There's one on collecting client feedback that does a really good job of walking you through some different options like focus groups and interviews and surveys and things like that.
Okay, well, we haven't seen any questions so far come through, but of course, if you have them, you can also reach out to Switchboard, and we can make sure that Brianne can get back to you on it.
Great. I may also, before we close out, to some extent, I did share 3 pretty basic tools that people can use, in some ways hoping that those were things that people could pretty easily incorporate in their current work. But if you are looking for some additional ideas, a very basic and general one of a wide range of participation and feedback ideas, the International Association for Public Participation has like a public participation toolkit, which just has a long list of different feedback reception options. So you could take a look at that also. Sorry. I just wanted to add that before we closed, Rebecca.
Of course, yep. If you could just go to the final slide.
Sure.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Brianne, so much for that presentation, and I hope everyone found it to be useful. Please do stay in touch with Switchboard by signing up for our newsletter and visiting us online. When you close the webinar, you will also be prompted to complete our feedback survey. This is really helpful to us in helping us improve future training, so I'd really appreciate it if you took a few moments to complete that survey. And with that, I will close out the session. Thank you again, Brianne, for presenting, and thank you everyone for joining us today.